Howdy, folks. Welcome back to the Suhu podcast, everybody. We are back with our Spring Reveals series looking at what's inside our skincare. So this is episode 3 of the series. This week we are looking at where our ingredients actually come from. So most people, when they are walking through the skincare aisle, they pick up their products, they look at the label, and that's where the story seems to start. You know, you're looking at the ingredient list, and it feels like that is the definitive source for what's inside the bottle. But the truth of the matter is that is actually just the end of the story. Every ingredient on that label had a long life before it ever reached a formulation lab, before it was ever packaged, and before it was ever put on the shelf for you to pick up. It started somewhere, usually in fields or crops or fermentation systems or chemical processing that began with agricultural materials. And once you start tracing your ingredients backwards instead of forward, that conversation around your skincare starts to change. Quality looks different, sustainability looks different, and even performance can start to make a little bit more sense. So today, we're going to zoom out a bit and talk about where cosmetic ingredients actually begin, not the marketing version, but the real path that your ingredients take before they ever reach your bottle. Lydia, from a chemistry side, when formulators talk about ingredient origin, how often are we actually talking about agriculture?
Yeah, I have a really good teacher. If you want to follow her, she's Science of Essentials on Instagram. She put this in a really good way, and I was just thinking about this now. Some ingredients on your bottle are constituents, or they are individual components, meaning like they're glycerin. So glycerin really should just have one molecular structure. It's one constituent. But then there are also ingredients that are like essential oils, right? Which have many different components in them. And so they have many different molecular structures. And whether things are refined from a plant to get to a individual component, or they're refined from a plant to give you a group of different molecular structures, the most important thing is to really understand, are you looking at, number one, like if it is coming from an agricultural source and it is a essential oil and has many different components to it, you want to understand the processing that essential oil went through, or whatever that ingredient is, so that you can actually really know at the end of the line that it's safe and it is what it's supposed to be. For individual components, sometimes those are built, in a lab, and they had some raw ingredients that were from a plant, and they were put together in a lab and then sold as the individual component. Or it could be, purified and refined all the way down to the individual component from a plant. I would say many, many, many ingredients have some traceability back to agriculture, whether we are looking at that essential oil that we were talking about, or you're looking at, something like glycerin, or something like even like vitamin C that might be built in a lab. Often the components are still coming from some refinement from an organic source, right? So most components of a formulation do start from some sort of raw, unprocessed material, often natural in origin. And it's just important to kind of understand the processing that those materials go through to get to the ingredient on your label.
Sweet, yeah, so let's dive into that. Like you were saying, Lydia, a surprising number of our cosmetic ingredients start as crops. I think we talked a lot about this last week in our plant-based, what does it actually mean podcast. Plants are the source for most of our feedstock for skincare ingredients. Seeds can be pressed into oils, plant sugars can be fermented into alcohols or other useful compounds. You've got starches that can be processed into humectants or emulsifiers that help hold formulas together. A great example that you brought up is glycerin. Glycerin shows up all over in skincare because it's a super useful ingredient to pull water into the skin and help support hydration. And a lot of glycerin used in the cosmetic industry actually begins with plant oils. So the ingredient name you see on the label may trace all the way back to a crop grown in a field, even if you are unable to identify that crop just by looking at the label. I don't know what a glycerin plant is, but most of the time you can trace it back to some crop somewhere. Let's see. Plant oils themselves follow a similar pattern, like sunflower oil or jojoba oil, which we use as a carrier oil in a lot of our products. Rosehip oil all of those obviously start as agricultural crops, and their fatty acid structure determines how they're going to interact with your skin barrier. So in many cases, the ingredient story is really beginning with the farming, the soil, the agricultural practices, etc. So Lydia, maybe you could tell us a bit more about those plant oils, how they're useful from like a chemistry standpoint.
Yeah, so funny enough that you mentioned glycerin, but a lot of plant oils actually are made out of triglycerides, which is a glycerin plus 3 fatty acids on it. And it doesn't matter too much that you understand what that actually looks like, but when you're thinking about how plant oils are useful to the skin, you can start to think about how their fatty acid profiles look, and then you can kind of understand what type of plant oil is best for your skin. And the cool thing about, some of these plant oils, depending on like what your values are when you're shopping, is like some of them are a little bit more friendly to the environment than others. So you might want to look for certain plant oils over others in ingredient lists. But the key thing here is if you see a plant oil on your ingredient list, it's usually, if it's towards the top of the ingredient list, it's usually being used as the carrier oil. And so that is one of the highest percentage ingredients in the product. And so you're going to want to make sure that whatever oil is being used is one that matches your skin type nicely.
Yeah, you brought up sustainability. I know one great example of that is palm oil, generally pretty poor with carbon. And even plant oils that might be not palm oil, if they're grown in the wrong area or shipped from all over the place, that has a really detrimental environmental effect as well. You mentioned fatty acid profiles. Maybe you could explain a little bit more why that matters in skincare.
Yeah, so basically when we're thinking about fatty acid profiles, there are different types of fatty acids that you can look for in a plant oil. And some of them are called essential fatty acids, which are basically like fatty acids that your skin naturally already has incorporated into it and are needed for your skin to maintain itself and to keep a healthy natural barrier support. And you can think of some oils, like you could think of sunflower oil, which is a little bit lighter, and that can be good for people if they're acne prone skin because it just feels a little bit lighter to the skin and it has, some of those essential fatty acids in it. One of the oils that we use a lot is called jojoba, which is actually technically a wax ester, and this is really, really nice for almost all skin types because it nearly perfectly mimics your skin's natural profile. And so it actually kind of tricks your skin into thinking that it is producing the right oils, and it really enforces like the natural skin barrier on its own. So we use jojoba oil for that reason. It's usually really good for sensitive skin types as well. But you can kind of, dig into this a little bit, like when you're looking at products, you can be like, oh, this product uses rosehip seed oil or grapeseed oil. Fine, sometimes is products will start to dilute the nicer oils with more refined oils that don't have all of these good fatty acids in them. So sometimes you'll see jojoba oil or something, and then next to it you'll see like 4 other different oils. My brain immediately goes to, why would they need all those different oils? Is it because they're trying to include a more wide range of fatty acid profile, or like what's actually going on there? And more often than not, it's because, these oils that are refined in a way that really retain the full profile of all of these really good molecules are expensive. And so you can put that at the top of your ingredient list, but then you can start to dilute it out with these other types of oils that are cheaper. Like you were kind of saying, Yorick, like some of these oils are not so great for the environment, right? Like things that are refined from palm oil, if they aren't under like really heavily regulated certification process, often contribute to mass destruction of, the environment. So it's also important to kind of look and see to make sure that whatever carrier oil is being used in your products really are harvested and refined in a way that's not, contributing to this massive destruction of our planet. So yeah, that's kind of my take on that. I think generally speaking, jojoba oil is great for most skin types. And then if you're like really concerned about like oiliness on your skin, you can kind of look into some of these other lighter oils. But usually people do really well with jojoba.
That's really cool. So the profile is almost like a way for you to filter how it's going to act on your skin. And the jojoba pretty much mimics the actual natural oils that you already have on your face. The way you were talking about the oils, it reminds me of peanut butter. If you pick up a jar of peanut butter at the grocery store and you look at the ingredient list, you'll almost always see the first ingredient's peanuts, but then right after it, it's palm oil, because they've extracted all the expensive peanut oil out of the product and then replaced it with the cheap palm oil. But that reminds me also of our podcast on reading ingredient labels. A real peanut butter that just has peanut oil, it's just going to say peanuts and maybe sugar or maybe salt, depending on the type of peanut butter you're buying. You're not going to see this long ingredient list with all these fillers stuff. And it's the same for skincare. You want to try to look for ingredient lists that where every ingredient on there is defensible, and not some like crazy thing that you've never heard of before.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, just like, the peanut butter, it starts out as just natural peanuts, and the way it's processed really changes the end product on the shelf. The same is true of our skincare ingredients. The harvesting of the crop is really just the first step. And once that raw material is collected, it still has to be processed into something that's stable and safe enough to use in a cosmetic formula. And that's where extraction and refinement come in. Some oils are cold pressed, which means mechanical pressure is used to extract the oil without any type of high heat. That can preserve certain compounds because that heat can sometimes break them down. But it can also introduce more variability between batches. Other ingredients are extracted using solvents. That method can increase your yield. You get more stuff when you get more out of it if you use a solvent, and it will improve your consistency. But it also adds processing steps and requires purification afterwards. And then there's refinement. Refinement can remove impurities and improve stability, which is important for shelf life and safety. But if your refinement goes too far, it can remove the compounds that might have actually been beneficial in that crop that you're harvesting in the first place. So there really isn't a single best method. And the right approach really depends on what the ingredient is that we're talking about and what the formulator needs it to do inside of your product. Now I need to segue to you. So Lydia, maybe you could help us dive deeper as the formulator into how you're determining how these things should be processed or refined.
Yeah, I mean, one of the biggest lessons that I've learned is there's a lot of information out there that's just wrong. And I think a combination of just willful negligence or actual intentional, lying happens in the world of plant oils and especially essential oils. And it's just, it comes, I think, with the territory because it's not, regulated in the same way that a drug would be, which for small brands allows the formulators to access these materials, which is awesome. But as the person doing the formulation, you have to be really educated on how to tell if a product is real or not. And I think the key thing is you talked about all these different processing techniques, and what you really need to hone in on is for a given material, what is the appropriate processing technique? And, is that actually what the supplier is doing? And then can you get some information from them to really prove or show that, your product is pure or your product is reflecting what you would expect out of that processing technique? And a good example of that would be an essential oil, for example. Essential oils really can only undergo a couple different processing techniques. They are either steam distilled or they are cold pressed or expressed. And when you are looking at the processing method, they should at the end of it be able to give you some kind of certificate of analysis that shows that, what's in the bottle is reflecting what should be in the bottle. And a really good example of how different compounds can arise from the same plant is rose essential oil is really, 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 amazing to use in skincare products. A lot of people have fake rose essential oil out there because real rose essential oil is hundreds of dollars per, not very much. And so people fake it. But rose undergoes a steam distillation process, and in that process, all of the compounds that are in the oil phase come together into the essential oil, and then people actually save all of the compounds that get filtered out in the water phase. And they make something called a rose hydrosol, which is basically the byproduct of making the rose essential oil. And those hydrosols are sold all the time, and they're awesome and amazing, and they're actually a little bit cheaper than the essential oil, but they don't have the same compounds in them, right, as the rose essential oil, because they have all the compounds that came out in the water phase. So this is a really good example of like what was in the original rose is getting split up into like 2 different products just because of this processing method. And you may choose to use one, the rose hydrosol, for certain things, but you might really want the compounds in the rose essential oil for other things, depending on like what product you're trying to make, right? So like as a formulator, it's like, oh, I need to know what the process is, what I should actually be seeing at the end, and then make sure that the supplier can like support that. And you know, for good suppliers, they should never question these things, right? Just they should be able to provide their analysis, they should be able to tell you their process, and they should be able to tell you the origin of the raw material. And that should never be something that they get, you know, upset about doing, right? They should just be like, okay, no problem, and give it to you. So my biggest suggestion for like formulators, and like especially if you're starting a new brand, is like make sure that your suppliers are doing what they're supposed to be doing. And then what was the other question?
What about the consumers? What should they be looking for when they're thinking about processing?
Yeah, for sure. It's a little harder as a consumer, right? Because not all of the brands out there are going to be able to publish this information like publicly. Some of this people would consider, you know, somewhat proprietary because we don't necessarily want to reveal who our suppliers are and whatnot. We're pretty transparent about our stuff. You can look on our
Suhu. If people want to know more about what's in their products, if they're buying from Suhu, what do we let people know?
Yeah, I mean, you can go to our website. We have a whole transparency page, and on that page, we give some really detailed information about our suppliers. You could probably figure out who they are if you want to, and that's okay with us. We really love the people that we work with, so just free PR to them. But yeah, like the key thing if you are looking at other products is you really need to evaluate like the brand trust, and that can be hard to do because there are some, you know, really trendy products that sell a lot and have good reviews but maybe don't meet that. And then there are also some really small brands that do an amazing job and they just might not publish this information. That's totally okay, right? But as the consumer, you just have to dig into it a little bit. And I think the main thing, which you hit on the head earlier, York, was just like, when you're looking at the ingredient list, just start to evaluate like what each ingredient does. The nice thing about like using AI now, right, is like you can just take a picture of the ingredient list. I know I've said this before. You just take a picture of the ingredient list and just be like, hey, can you quickly analyze this list and tell me about it. Tell me about the environmental impact. Tell me about the healthiness of each ingredient. Tell me about any red flags that you notice, and AI will give you a whole report. It'll be pretty accurate, you know, and so you can kind of use these tools to help figure out at least what questions you might want to ask of the brand if you do want to ask questions, or maybe you look at it and you're like, it looks great, and you know you don't want to ask any follow-up questions. But I think the main thing is just like, you know, finding out if you want to dig further and knowing kind of what questions to ask.
So we talked a little bit about steam distilled and cold pressed, but another product pathway is fermentation. So some cosmetic ingredients, they aren't extracted directly from the plants at all. They are fermented. And in that process, you take plant sugars that are used as the feedstock, and microorganisms convert those sugars into new compounds. And hyaluronic acid is a pretty good example of that process. Hyaluronic acid used in skincare today is produced through bacterial fermentation rather than being extracted from animal tissue as it once was. And then the microbes are actually the ones that are doing the building of these molecules during the fermentation process. So Lydia, maybe you could tell us a little bit about the hyaluronic acid that's being fermented and how we're using fermentation at Suhu.
This type of production method is really amazing, right? Like you can make a lot of very specific pure ingredients by simply growing them and harvesting them from, you know, a bacterial culture. And one thing just to note about this, like, you know, you want to follow up, like if you're a formulator and you want like vegan products, right? You want to follow up with the supplier to make sure that the ingredients used to sustain the bacteria are non-dairy. And sometimes they are, sometimes they aren't. So that's another example where if you're a formulator, you just want to double check with your supplier that they're, you know, creating the ferment in a way that is still, animal product free. What's interesting, right, is like you can make at scale a lot of really cool molecules. So this is like a really awesome way that like chemists create molecules across all different types of industries, right? Hyaluronic acid is interesting to me for a couple of reasons. One, a lot of people don't know this about hyaluronic acid, but it's often used as a way to pull water into the skin. But depending on the environment you're in, it can have slightly different effects. So hyaluronic acid on its own is very, 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 has a high affinity for water. So it definitely pulls water in, but it pulls water into itself. So if the hyaluronic acid is in or on the surface of your skin and you're in a humid environment, it's going to pull water from the environment onto or into your skin, which is what you want. But just as a PSA, if you're in a very dry environment or your skin is very dry or has any kind of, damage to it, if you put hyaluronic acid on, it can actually pull water out of your skin onto the surface of your skin, which is not really what we want. So if you are using like hyaluronic acid as a ingredient in your skincare, just like keep in mind the type of environment that you're in and just use it for a week, see if it's really making a difference. If not, I typically don't put it in our products. But yeah, it's a really great example of how you can use a microorganism to make very specific molecular weights of hyaluronic acid, which are then used in products.
How are we using fermentation at Suhu?
Yeah, so we have one product that uses basically the product of fermentation, which is a lactobacillus ferment. And so this is used as a natural, I know we've toyed around with the word natural before, but this is used as a better option to other preservatives. It preserves our lotion and does it in a way that is not going to, contribute to potential like endocrine disruptors or other types of issues that can come along with adding preservatives, but it does help keep a bacteria out. And so that's what we use it for. And it's pretty solid. I hear
the word lacto. Is that milk?
Yeah, that's funny, right? Like, it sounds like it could be related to milk, but it is actually just the species name of the bacteria. So it's lactobacillus bacteria. And so that's the name of the microorganism. And from a standpoint of like putting it on your skin, beyond the antimicrobial properties, it also helps to condition your skin. And it can help even with your own skin's microbiome, which is super important to keep healthy. It's kind of like putting a probiotic on your face in the same way that you might take like a probiotic pill. So yeah, it's a really cool way to like add a preservative that's a little bit more gentle and helpful for your skin's like natural conditions.
Do we know that our lactobacillus supplier is fermenting our lactobacillus in a plant-based way?
We do. I'm curious if they say it the way that I think they're going to say it though. Can I pull it up real quick?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so this is actually really interesting. So I just pulled this up. This is our certificate of origin for our lucidal liquid SF, which is the name of our lactobacillus ferment. And the way that they say it, right, is they'll be like, blah, 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 technology certifies that the above listed ingredient can be classified as a vegan compliant ingredient. And then they'll also say, blah, 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 certifies that the above listed ingredient has never been tested on animals. And then they will follow up with an additional follow-up, which is like certifies that neither we nor any part of our supply chain have ever allowed contact with animal, milk, or grape-based ingredients. We further certify that the above listed ingredient does not contain any ingredients, incidental ingredients, or processing aids that have been grown on land fertilized with sewage sludge. So we have a lot of different information here about our lucidal liquid SF that we use. But yeah, that's a perfect example of like, gotta follow up with the supplier and make sure that they, can provide these statements and the information appropriately.
Yeah, so you kind of brought this up. We're talking about things being natural versus synthetic, and that conversation starts to get a little bit more complicated when we're introducing processing. So even ingredients that are described as synthetic, those often start with plant feedstocks. Plant oils and plant sugars can act as the raw materials for chemical reactions that create emulsifiers or stabilizers or all these other cosmetic ingredients that look crazy when you're looking at the ingredient list. But by the time those reactions are finished, the final molecule is highly refined and very consistent, which is sometimes something that you really need in your formulations. But the carbon atoms themselves in that molecule may still trace back to a plant. So when you follow the supply chain backward, a lot of cosmetic ingredients end up sitting somewhere in the middle of natural or synthetic. They start with agriculture and they end as these carefully refined molecules designed to behave very consistently on your skin. So Lydia, maybe you could explain a little bit about what really matters to a formulator from a chemistry perspective instead of the marketing language, natural or synthetic.
Yeah, I mean, the first place my head goes is like safety and like understanding the safety profile of if it is the constituent, like we were talking about earlier, an individual molecule, what is the safety of that molecule for someone? And then if it's a mixture of molecules, like in the essential oil, what is like the allergens and the safety of the essential oil? Like that's kind of the first place that my head goes when I'm thinking about things. And going backwards from there, like depending on the environmental impact, like whether it's better to buy the material as purified from a plant or better to buy the material as the individual constituent, you can start to kind of compare these different processing methods. Like sometimes, like you said, it's actually much better to do it, through a lab-made option. Like certainly a lot of like mica, for example, is a good example of something that is often made in a lab to like give the glittery effect in like some vegan makeup products and things, and that like hands down is better in the lab environment because you can actually trace where it's coming from. And when you can't, like most of the non-lab made products use unsafe labor practices in other in places around the world, right? So understanding, secondarily, it's like, oh, how do I want to actually get the material, right? Like, what am I looking for in the processing of it? But yeah, I would say like there's no reason to be like afraid, quote unquote, of things that are quote unquote synthetic, because I think you put it really well. Like most things fall somewhere in the middle. Yeah, so like, some examples that are relevant, right, would be like we use a THD ascorbate in our vitamin C serum. And when we're thinking about this, right, like the actual components there, we have an ascorbic acid and we have it getting protected with a fatty acid. And essentially that reaction to link those two things together and make the THD ascorbate happens in a lab. But the individual component molecules that go into that reaction are often traced back to plants, like we were talking about before. And when we're thinking about the final product here, rather than just using ascorbic acid like you would find in an orange or something like that, this molecule is better at penetrating the skin, and it is more stable, and it is overall like just a easier molecule to work with in formulations and works well with most people's skin. And so this is a great example of like science coming forward and being like, let's make something that is actually better, and using nature kind of as the guide, and then using our chemistry knowledge to improve upon that a little bit. So that's a really great example of something that's good. Where I tend to draw the line here is like if the purpose of the molecule is understood and safe, and the purpose is to improve the product for the end consumer's overall skin's benefit, then great. If the purpose of the synthetic material is to disregard health concerns and just create a more shelf-stable product that can undergo much higher temperature ranges and can be shipped across the world and frozen and thawed and heated and delivered to you and sit on a shelf for 4 years, if that's the only purpose of that ingredient, then usually that for me feels more of a red flag, right? Because then you're like, well, do we really understand the safety data for that ingredient? Do we really fully know that it's okay for people to use? And if our only purpose is to really like, make this product like sit on a shelf for 3 or 4 years or 5 years, then maybe we should be questioning like why we're using it in the first place, right? So that's kind of how I think about it from like a chemistry perspective.
Yeah, it sounds like what you're saying is synthetic cuts both ways. Sometimes we can synthetically make a molecule in the lab that's going to make a product safer or more stable for the end consumer. Sometimes we can make a product that is going to increase profit by allowing a product to sit on the shelf for a billion years, freeze thaw, etc., but maybe not necessarily be the best for the end consumer's skin. So at the end of the day, it sounds like the molecule itself is what matters, not so much the origin of the feedstock. Like, I think what you said made me think a lot about diamonds. Like, you can go out and buy a diamond that's been mined, but, you know, typically that is going to involve a lot of forced labor, horrible environmental conditions, etc. But you can make the exact same molecule synthetically in the lab. They're indistinguishable from a chemistry perspective, and they function in the exact same way. And so in some cases, like that, you would want the synthetic option over the more natural option. And then I think I can use that to transition into the soil stuff. And so for the ingredients that we're talking about that start with agriculture, just like the mining practices matter for these diamonds, the farming decisions matter a lot for these agricultural feedstocks. So things like, you know, soil health that can influence the composition of plant oils, pesticide practices affect the residue levels when you're doing all this processing. Harvest times can change the concentration of certain compounds in these crops. And this is where certifications like organic farming come into the conversation. Check out episode 1 of the Spring Reveal series if you want to hear more about organic versus natural and what these words really mean. Now that doesn't change the molecular structure though, but it can influence the environmental impact of the farming practices and the types of inputs used during cultivation. And so for brands that think about sustainability, those upstream decisions become part of the formulation thinking, because where an ingredient comes from includes the land and the labor behind it.
Yeah, like it's so interesting, right? Like it's really like at the end product that we're looking at, we are interested in knowing that the molecules that we're putting on our skin are going to be functional in the way that we want them to be. And for that reason, we want things to be consistent, we want things to be pure, and we want things to be relatively simple. And I put that in there at the end. I don't know if everyone would agree with me on that, but like the more elegant and refined, like maybe simple is like not conveying the right thing, but the more elegant your formula can be, meaning how can I get to the end user experience with the least amount of ingredients, tends to also be, in my opinion, the most functional and have the least number of impurities, because you're just introducing less variables, right? And it's actually super interesting, like you just said about like pesticide residue, right? Like depending on how good the farming practices are and depending on how good the processing is, sometimes some of those pesticides come with and they end up, you know, in small amounts in the final product. And I didn't even know this until recently, maybe like a year and a half ago or something, but like you can think about this a lot with like supplements and things, right? Like a lot of times our supplements just have other things in them because they've just come along in the process. And so like you were saying, York, like it's great if you can kind of look at the brand and be like, oh, they like test their product, or there's like more information about where these things are coming from, because you don't want like microplastics and pesticide in your final product that you're eating. And I think, you know, similarly to your skin's absorbing everything that you put on it. You want to ensure that the ingredients are what they, you know, what your brand says they actually are, you know?
Yeah, actually, just last week when I was putting together a graphic, I was looking into a few of our competitors' moisturizers, and, you know, a lot of people use this very all-natural language and marketing on their copy, but then you dig into their ingredient list and they've got, you know, 40 some ingredients in something that's just supposed to be a lotion. And that's something that I really appreciate that's something that I really appreciate about the way you formulated a lot of these Suhu products. We have a lotion, it's got 7 ingredients, and it does not take a long time to Google each one, figure out what it's supposed to be doing and why it's there. And you don't even really have to do that because we put that information transparently on the product page. So yeah, if you take anything from today's podcast, if you take anything from today's podcast, when the skincare conversation is focused just on the ingredient names, when you're walking down the aisle and you're picking up the products and you're just looking at those ingredients, you're losing sight of the larger systems behind them. An oil isn't just a word on a label. A humectant isn't just a chemical name. In reality, every single one of those ingredients represents a formulator's decision around farming, extraction, processing, transportation, refinement, and then ultimately accumulating into formulation. Skincare really doesn't begin in a lab. It begins in the fields, in fermentation systems and supply chains that stretch all the way back to the agriculture at the beginning of each feedstock or ingredient's life. And the ingredient list on the bottle is just the final chapter of that process. And once you understand where your ingredients actually come from, it becomes much easier to see how quality and sustainability and formulation are connected.
Yeah, I was just thinking, it's kind of funny, like we were talking before about like the 2 key things people should look for on an ingredient label. It's like the purpose for the ingredient and then like the percent, or, you know, is it in the formulation in a way that it actually has an effect. And now we've kind of added like a third P, it's like the processing. And like, you know, the question you ask is just, hey, what's the ingredient? What is the correct processing method for this ingredient? Is that what the brand or the supplier is doing? And those are really the most important things to ask. And like, you will start to just intuitively gravitate towards brands, and if you're a formulator, suppliers, where you're like, yeah, okay, I can see that they have their stuff together. I think where things get dangerous, it's like in the lack of information and the sharing of misinformation. There's just like a lot of misinformation out there, and brands take advantage of that. They're like, people don't know what these things actually are, so let's market it as natural, or let's market it as like, we don't use any synthetic stuff. But now you guys know synthetic is not necessarily bad. It just depends on what is the ingredient. Is it safe, and how are they producing it? Is it better to be synthetic? Is it better for the environment to be synthetic, or is it not, right? And just understanding each kind of individual ingredient.
Well, thank you, Lydia.
You're welcome.
Guys, if you guys want to go deeper into this topic, we wrote a whole blog post on our site, suhuskin.com/blog, walking through the supply chains behind cosmetic ingredients and how that journey shapes what ends up in the bottle. And stick around next week in our Spring Reveals What's Inside series. We will be discussing how packaging affects what's actually inside our products. So thanks again. Feel free to leave comments, etc. We'll see you next week.
Bye.